Hi there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. Today we have James Avery as our guest. He's the CEO and founder of Kevel, the API platform for building ad platforms. He's also founded and exited TekPub and is a former software engineer and an O'Reilly and Microsoft Press author. Thanks for joining us on the show, James.
Hey, thanks for having me, David.
So I've actually gone through and taken a look at a couple of O'Reilly textbooks in the past. How does one become an O'Reilly author? And
Oh
what
man,
was your specific domain?
yeah, that's going back. I wrote them like it was like 10 years ago now. But I was a software developer before I started Kevel, and I wrote a blog, and started realizing I liked writing about technology, and actually wrote for Microsoft Press. But then I always wanted to write for O'Reilly. So I was always just a huge fan of O'Reilly. Like they're much more, kind of geek cred, like open source and but they were trying to write about Microsoft technologies as well, which is what I was like more focused on at the time. And so I wrote like Visual Studio Hacks, which was one of like their kind of hacks books of like different tips and tricks on like how to use Visual Studio. But yeah, basically it was emailing people there and pitching them ideas until they said, all right, like write a sample chapter and show us what you do. So you can kind of just, tech books aren't, it's not like getting published by Random House. You can kind of find who you need to email and work your way in there.
Do you remember what animal is on the cover of your book?
So I didn't get an animal, which
Oh,
really
you didn't get an animal.
like
You
no. So
got cheated.
I wrote two books for them but they were both in like the tools kind of side of things. So they were doing tools on the cover. So one of them was like a voltage detector, and the other one is like a saw, I think.
Hmm.
It's over there somewhere. Yeah, so it was kind of disappointing that I didn't get the other one.
Do you have an animal you wish was on the cover?
I don't know. I probably an Oriole bird.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the Orioles, so
Hmm.
very homerish pick there. But yeah.
So more on the actual topic. Kevel, I recognize that it's an API business. Is that right? Where you want a lot of people to hook into your platform. Is that right?
Yeah, so yeah, we kind of taken the same approach as Twilio or Stripe, where we
Hmm.
say let's take something that is kind of confusing, hard to build, has a lot of dependencies, has a lot of like specialized knowledge to build it, and say let's wrap that in an API.
Hmm.
And so in our case, it's a decision engine built for advertising. So when you want to go build like an auction, like what Facebook or Google have built, or Pinterest, like these people, they build auction platforms that customers can come in and say, I want to spend
Hmm.
$100 a day, and how do you target it? How do you handle pacing and budgeting and all of those things? We've kind of wrapped all that in a set of APIs.
And how do you know this is something that you? How do you know this was the platform to build when you first got started?
Oh, I didn't know at all for sure.
Okay.
So going actually, it's an interesting story. So like going back to when I was writing that blog, I was invited to join a small ad network,
I
and
see.
so I joined this small ad network. Really, an ad network focused on kind of serving better ads. So not the kind of annoying banner ads that you see everywhere. Then the guy who was running it decided to shut it down, and so I volunteered to take it over. It was
Hmm.
a very small ad network, so really kind of I was still doing consulting, software engineering, and so I kind of like fell into the ad industry. And so I built that out for a while, ended up selling the ad network and focusing on the software I was building.
I see.
And then we realized that ad networks aren't that great of a business. And I was trying to sell software
Hmm.
targeted to ad networks. But we got lucky because I was a software engineer, I just built a good API for it.
Hmm.
And then customers started. We realized the deals we were closing were for customers who were using that API. And so there's always that moment kind of when you're starting a company where you're like, wow, like we're not, we're signing these customers we didn't think we would sign, and we're not signing any of the ones we thought we would sign. And so you have that like moment of reflection where you're like, okay, well, why are we signing these customers and not these other customers? And we
You've
realized
been working.
it was because they all said like, well, we wanted a flexible API solution because what we're doing is unique and what we're doing is slightly different. And so we realized that's really the business we kind of accidentally built. And then we leaned into it, right? And said, okay, let's make sure everything has a great API. Let's improve our APIs. Let's really enable customers to build even more.
You've been working on Kevel for a little less than a decade. Is that right?
A little bit more than a decade.
A little
Yeah.
more than a decade. Okay.
Yep.
Do you remember what the MVP was?
Yeah, so the because of how it started, the MVP was actually what I needed to run my own ad network.
Oh, okay,
So I
gotcha.
really like dog food, like ate my own
Hmm.
dog food from the beginning because it was, I was building the software to run my own ad network. And then, so I knew I had like an MVP.
Hmm.
And then I went to try to sell it to other people, and they're like, "Well, you have a, MP, you don't have the viable part." And so then we built the parts that like made it viable.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was really, it's ideal whenever you can do that, right? If you can build something that's solving your own problem. It's not always
Hmm.
possible, but in this case, it worked out.
Is the set of all advertiser networks that you're trying to market to fairly large, or is it fairly small? Or are
Yeah,
you trying to
so
go more direct now?
no, I mean, so nowadays, like we don't really work with a lot of ad networks these
Okay,
days. Like
got
we
it.
do a handful, but like
Yeah.
most ad networks have kind of gone by the wayside unless
Okay.
they're kind of really specialized.
Hmm.
Um, and so the companies we tend to work with are really, it's a pretty wide gamut of everything from like Ticketmaster uses us to customize the shows that are promoted on the front page of Ticketmaster,
Hmm.
to things like Edmunds, where if you're searching for cars, they want to show like a really good native ad listing for the car. So like I'm looking for
Hmm.
Toyota Camrys, like here's a great looking ad for a Toyota Camry. To people like Strava who use us for like promoting kind of like revenue ops, where they're like promoting, here's where you can sign up, you should upgrade to pro, or here's a challenge you should sign up for, and things like that.
So I imagine a lot of these companies are choosing to turn to your platform versus building their own due to the complexities of trying to create one. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a kind of classic. We kind of call it like build. People call it build or buy,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
really with an API, it's like you're in the middle ground
Hmm.
because you're not buying something totally off the shelf. Like you're
Right.
usually having to build something around something on top of the APIs, but it's also not building everything yourself.
So can you talk about some of the complexities as to why it's difficult to build your own versus just working with an existing API? Like what's stopping these other companies? They're fairly large and I imagine they have fairly hefty budgets to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things, right? Like I think there's a lot of really complex engineering and pacing and budgeting, right? And like figuring out how often to serve something. And then there's also the scale side of it, right? I mean,
Mm.
like for any of these companies, you're talking about something that can handle thousands of requests a second,
Hmm.
and the average speed has to be like 30 to 40 milliseconds to return a
Right.
response. And so those things create like a pretty tough engineering challenge that, most engineers like aren't building at those kind of that scale and like tolerance.
I see.
And then you have to like figure out how to do it where then you also have like the reporting side of it, right? Which is like another challenge of making sure you're tracking things in the right way. And it just turns out to be a lot of kind of specialized knowledge. And so when you look at, I think it was Twitter, like the CEO of Twitter was talking about it one time, Dick Costello. He was like, when they went to build an ad platform, they were like, we just had to go hire people from Google. Like, because like we had to go find people that had like done this
Yeah.
before. So it is that kind of like specialized knowledge, just like with Twilio, where it's like how to work with the legacy, telecom companies to send text messages, right? It's not like there's a bunch of people looking for jobs that have that knowledge. And it's the same in this kind of high scalability space where, there's a lot of work that goes into both scaling as well as that, the kind of learning that has to take place to do balancing and targeting and all that stuff.
30 to 40 milliseconds is pretty impressive, especially if that's at the P99 level, or is that more of like an average P50 case?
No, that's like it's like P95 is what we normally
Okay.
track for 30 to 40 milliseconds. Yeah, I mean it depends. It also depends a lot on like what the set of ads is,
Yeah.
right? And so like some customers had goals of like under 20 milliseconds, which you can
Okay.
hit, but it requires kind of the tuning of
Yeah,
like,
yeah, a
okay,
little
you
bit of
can't use
trade-off.
this feature and you can't do X, and we
Yeah.
can get you down to that.
Hmm.
And then some it's more like 50 to 60 because of like their auction size or what they're targeting with, and like they're okay with that.
How difficult is it to take all these different, I guess, clients and try to satisfy all their needs? Because clearly, solving a problem in 20 milliseconds and solving versus 60 could be a huge challenge on its own. Like you have to have all these extra hooks in, I guess, in the API layer that says don't do this, don't do that, or don't spend more than this amount of time, or don't enable these features. Was that something that was complicated?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely when you have. I mean, I think that's like the challenge of an API, like building an API platform, right? Is that you have to figure out what's the common subset But then you do have those features where like, oh, this customer wants this, but this one doesn't. And there's times where, like people are using different subsets of your features. And so like in the code, like there's nowhere where we're saying, don't do this for X or don't do this
Okay,
for Y. It's really more for the customer where we say, look, like you can use this type of targeting,
I
but
see.
it's computationally expensive and it's going to add 3 or 4 milliseconds to your response time. And they can decide, okay, I don't want to use that type of targeting, so they just don't put it on their ads or they don't make it available to their customers. Or they say, oh, that's a fine trade-off for us. Like we're okay with it, being 4 milliseconds slower because that targeting we can charge a lot more because of that. And so
Do
it's
you
actually
find that?
nice because it makes them make, like they have to look at the trade-offs
Yeah,
versus,
yeah.
sometimes, it's like you're, doing engineering work. The customer's always like, oh, I want everything and I want it all in it.
That was the next question I was going to ask. Like, how do, like, I imagine sometimes you have a customer that knows what they want in terms of the high level, but they don't understand the trade-offs. Like, how do you ever have like a like non-technical client that you have to work with and implement it for them, or do you recommend a consultant to do that, or how do you do it for these like smaller businesses that don't have it in-house, like call it CTO?
Yeah. I mean, today we like primarily the customers we work with have developers,
I
right?
see.
Like they
Okay.
have people on staff who are going to build on this. Sometimes it's only one or two, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's like 50, right? Like it just depends on the size of the team. But yeah, today we don't do any consulting ourselves. Like
Okay.
we love the Twilio model there, right? Of like, like you build the network. So we do
Mhm.
have some consulting companies that we refer people to that can go help them do that if they don't have their own resources.
I see. And is it usually a like set it and forget it for your clients where they just build it once and they just uh, call your API, or like they have some wrapper in house that like calls your API and you never really had to interact with them? Is it really like Twilio? Because when I worked with Twilio, I never contacted anyone who worked at the company like directly, except maybe like one support ticket when we went over our API limits.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunately it's not as simple as
Okay.
like Twilio's text message, API, right? It's like anybody can go figure that out like in a
Right.
hack
Right.
day, hack weekend and like start sending text messages and you're done. Because like the way people use us, so they're building this kind of ad program or ad platform. They end up, they want to make improvements over time and they want to tweak things and they might have an advertiser come to them and say, we want to be able to do this. And they'll come to us and say, can we do this? And say, oh,
Hmm.
yeah, that feature's enabled. Here's how you use it. Here's how it works. And then maybe they do a little extra work. So there's definitely a little bit. It's not like I guess we're kind of somewhere between like the Twilio like developer sign up and just do whatever they want, and the like consulting like we come in and solve the problem for you. We're that middle ground of like you're gonna have to do some work, but we'll help you with it. Like we'll have we have a great team of solution architects that work with our customers to help them figure out here's how to use the platform or here's how to fix that issue or solve that problem.
Was this like consulting concept more available and you call it years one and two, or is it something you from the outset decided wasn't scalable and you didn't want to invest into it?
Yeah, no, we never did it.
Okay.
And that's because I came from consulting. So there's a
Okay.
little bit of just me like not wanting to get back into consulting.
Okay.
I spent so much time where you're just, working on a project and they're changing their mind and they're, you're haggling over what what you originally bid as the estimate and what the estimate's going to actually be now that they've changed their mind 3 times. And I just didn't want to get back into that.
I've taken a look at your LinkedIn and it looks like you've been self-employed for a good number of years now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the last time I worked for somebody else was 2003.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is when you first decided to start your own consulting firm, did you knew you eventually wanted to get into products, or did you make that decision later?
Yeah, I definitely made that decision later. Like
Okay.
so I was, I worked for a couple of companies. Like I worked at Dell, and I worked at a couple other companies, and then ended up working at a consulting company, doing consulting because as an engineer, like I did, I think nowadays, like engineers all want to work at like great product companies, but I think back then like being a consultant a lot of times meant you got to work on really like exciting new projects and using new technology and you were
Hmm.
coming in to rip out like the big legacy code at a bank and like get to build something from scratch with all the newest tech. um, and so like I that drew me to consulting. And then once I was doing consulting for somebody else, I realized pretty quickly like, oh, like they're keeping like 40% of my bill rate, right? And I'm like, so I can charge, I can charge people 20% less and I'll make 20% more. So that seems like a good outcome.
Hmm.
I was kind of an independent consultant for,
Hmm.
3 or 4 years, which was also a lot of fun. Like I think consulting doesn't get the, you know, street cred it should from a standpoint of like understanding how to run a business.
Hmm.
Because like I would go in as as a consultant and I'd learn how these like big giant companies worked, right? And I'd understand like, all the things that went into like how these companies ran and like what their problems were and how to get this to work. And it was kind of like, you get to be like the mini CEO of like a consulting project and learn a lot. Like we'd hire people up, like we'd hire in new consultants. You'd figure out, oh, some of them didn't work. We got to get rid of them. Like all this kind of trial stuff for like when you actually go and start a company.
What are some of your lessons that you're really glad you learned in the world of consulting before you moved into the world of building, call it platforms and products?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of them is around is that hiring piece, right? Like I think it was fashionable for a while to say like hire fast, fire fast. But it's in like if you have a heart, like it's impossible to fire fast, right?
Right, right.
You're like, well, they just started. It's only been a month, right?
Mhm.
Like we gotta give them a chance. And then you're like, well, they're starting to show some improvement. So let's give them a little bit more, right? And then you realize like down the road, you're like, oh, we're missing these dates because we're 4 months in and this person's not performing. And
Right.
then you have to start the whole hiring process over again. It takes you another 2 months to find somebody else.
Hmm.
And so to me, it's always important. Like it's better to hire a little bit slower, and because as much as you say you will fire fast, it's really hard to fire fast. And even firing fast isn't fast enough for the cost of like hiring a bad fit.
So
I think
when you say bad fit, are you talking about performance, culture, or both?
I think mostly performance.
Okay.
Like I think like culture fits can be really, I don't know, it's such a nebulous term, right? And I think
It really is.
and I think a lot of times it's probably used for the wrong reasons, right? Like, oh, this person wants us to think about what we do before we do it, and you're like, well, that's probably a good friction, not like a bad culture fit. And I think that like the bad culture fits tend to over time you see that cost. And like in consulting, it wasn't, consulting projects were usually 9 to 12 months, and so it was like, if somebody was an asshole, you just dealt with them for 9 months and you got the job done and you went
Hmm.
your separate ways. Um, I'd say the other interesting thing was really working, dealing with these big massive companies and understanding how their kind of buying process can work
Hmm.
because you would start to see how they made decisions. Like I remember one company I was at, they were using like Microsoft SQL Server, and then it just like came down on high that like, oh, we're switching to Oracle. And we learned that they're going to pay Oracle like $1 million a year or whatever it is to like switch to this, and nobody in engineering knew about it. Nobody
Hmm.
like knew why they were moving, and now we had a new project. We had to like move everything we've been doing that was on SQL Server to Oracle. And I eventually went and talked to the guy who did the purchasing and like understand why and things like that. But it's really fascinating to like learn how these big companies work because when you start a company, you're going to be selling to them.
Hmm.
And so it's like if you only ever worked at startups, you don't know what it's like to be like your buyer at a Fortune 500 company trying to buy something, right? Like the
Hmm.
amount of effort and work that can go into that. And so I think it's really valuable to learn that.
Do you have a specific lesson in terms of about that like buying cycle that you felt like, dang, I am so glad I knew that before starting Kevel?
Um, I can't think of a specific one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And earlier you mentioned how you had like challenges finding like competent talent. Is this in the realm of like technical talent?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've had that challenge at Kevel, but when I was
Okay, I
doing
see.
consulting, like, and especially in the consulting space, there's this like misincentive where consulting companies bill by the hour,
Yeah.
no matter if that person's good or not. And
Yeah.
so, it wasn't my consulting company. I was usually like working for another company and they'd like brought me in or I was working for the main company and helping hire other consultants. But there's like this extreme pressure to like fill the seat because
Okay.
that seat is just missing bill rate for that consultancy. And so you'd hire people, light vetting and hire them, and then you just pay that cost until
Hmm.
you can figure out how to get them out. And then there's pressure not to get them out because hey, they're still billing. But at the end of the day, like I always looked at it as like I'm not here to get as much bill rate for this company as possible.
Right,
I'm
right.
here to like make a successful project so I can
Right.
go do the next one, right?
So I'm not sure if you're familiar in like Silicon Valley, all the major like companies nowadays use these like concept like coding challenges that are kind of based on things you might face in school, kind of based on things like lead code, um, these 25 to 50-minute like coding exercises.
Yep.
Is that something you use within your company, or do you use a different strategy for vetting engineering like related roles?
Yeah, we don't, as far as I know, we don't use any coding challenges. We did in the past. We tried to have
Yeah.
like some kind of like a homework challenge. But what we found is that, we have some really good people that can interview for technical, kind of aptitude. And I think they do a
Hmm.
really good job with that. I will say that like we tend to, I think just because of the problem space and how complex it is, like we do tend to hire more senior engineers than
Hmm.
like junior engineers. And I remember that, and I think for if we were hiring a lot of junior engineers, then I think the coding challenge is a great thing to do, right?
Hmm.
'Cause at the end of the day, it's like we just want to know, like, if we give you a simple problem, can you write some JavaScript and like run it and show that it works, right? And like watch you do it. But if you have somebody who has 10 years experience, and you're like, here, like, solve this challenge. Like, I care so much less about that than I do about, hey, how would you solve this challenge? And we'll whiteboard something, or nowadays
Hmm.
virtually whiteboard it. Whiteboard some challenge, or we're dealing with a distributed system, and have them think through, like, how would you solve this? And we feel like that gets us a lot closer to like the people we want to hire,
Hmm.
because we are hiring kind of more senior people.
I see.
And also,
I
like,
mean,
I can't imagine like, somebody who's been working as an engineer for 10 years, like with a straight face, being like, reverse this array for us and give your choice. And then deciding whether you hire like a senior engineer based on whether they can reverse the array. I've heard stories of, like, oh, we interviewed somebody who has 10 years experience and they couldn't do this. And I'm like, yeah, they were probably freaking out because they're in an interview and they're probably worked at a big company where 90% of their day was meetings discussing what was going to get done, not, hammering out JavaScript to reverse arrays.
when I was at Uber, I was interviewing a good number of people, and there were a couple of people I interviewed that had like over the 15-year mark in experience, and the interview success rate for those were amongst the lowest in terms of the coding challenges,
Yep.
but amongst the highest in terms of the architectural interviews. And I always find that kind of interesting that I think they're using the wrong tool for the wrong solution as a interviewing org, but whatever.
Yeah, well, and I
That
think it
voice
just
might be
comes down to like, what do you want that person to do, right? Because
right,
it's
right,
like, if you're a sufficiently large org, you're going to have people who are mostly working on architecture and large things and not, hands-on keyboard coding all day.
right.
And so, like, I think that's what happens with a lot of those people. It's like, oh, they must be a terrible engineer. They did terrible in this. It's like, no, they're in meetings all day. They're working on diagrams. They're
Hmm.
discussing, how to build this, right?
Can you walk me through how, like, I guess your experience at Kevel has changed from call it year one to year three to year five to year 10? Like, how much of your day-to-day life has, like, been different from just those different stages of your life, like company
Yeah.
lifetime?
So it changes all the time, and I'll say that like I think it's the reason I feel as excited as I did like day one is
Hmm.
because it's kind of a new job every 18 months. And that's what I used to do when I was consulting, right? It's the same thing. Like, you go on a consulting gig, do it for, 9 to 18 months, and then you're out. But yeah, I mean, like, year one was just me writing code, me doing sales, me answering support tickets, me getting alerted on a Saturday of an issue and having to fix it, right? Like, was just doing everything.
Hmm.
And then once we raised money back in 2011, and that let me actually hire some people, right? So I could hire people in sales, I could hire, support people, some other engineers, but I still did all that stuff to a lesser extent, right? So like I wasn't doing every sales call, but if it was a big
Hmm.
customer, like when you're small, like I'm on that call, like I'm in that meeting, right? Like
Hmm.
it wasn't until I don't know, I mean, it was probably 6, 7 years in, I was still, going to a big call, big sales call if there was one. And I would still do it today, right? Like I think that's always part of the CEO's job. It's big enough, once we can travel again. But it's a lot, like the bar keeps going up, right? When you're starting, if it's the customer could pay you $20,000 a year, I'm like, I'll go talk to him. And now it's like, well, no, now it's like got to be a pretty big customer, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that like, we would do that. Um, and then coding. So I'd say for the first 3. 3 to 4 years, I was still coding a decent amount. Like I remember I would work all day, come home, see my wife, hang out a little bit, and then I'd go code again at night. I like to tell people I became a Dodgers fan because those were the games like I could watch because I'm on the East Coast, but the West Coast games were nine. So I'd like start with the Dodgers game and watch till midnight or one, and then go to bed.
Hmm.
Um, and that was about year. Oh, I guess how far ago was it now? I'd say like it's like four years ago, so about 5 6 years in, like I really stopped writing any production code. And I think it was after the first time I was like, I can handle this, and like went and banged it out, and then like pushed it up to Git, and it didn't even like build, and I'm like, I forgot that part. Like all right, I'm done. Like I'm not being helpful here. Like I'm now just causing issues. So eventually got completely out of coding. I'm not on nightly alerts anymore. That was probably about the same time. Um, and then really it's been once we got to about 20 people, a lot of it became more about like how do we help grow this team, um, and how do I help the leaders that report to me, and like whether help them help their teams, right, or help them with the challenges they're dealing with, or help them on the cross, the things that are going across teams, right, like whether it's interfacing between marketing and sales. And then recently, as we've grown from we're I guess about a year ago we were like 30 people, and now we're like 60, so we like doubled in the
Hmm.
last year. It's a lot of hiring, it's a lot of figuring out the right org structure, it's a lot of figuring out what are the processes like we need to have in place. And I've always been like very very light process, so it's like what's the minimum amount of process we need, but sometimes you need something, right?
Right.
um, and then also I say that the thing that's been going through the kind of the whole of my time is just focusing on like the product. Like I think there's different types of CEOs of like some are more sales focused, some are more marketing focused. Like I'm definitely more product focused, and still spend a lot of time with the with the product managers, and the engineers. And like I love still talking about big kind of innovative stuff that we're working on and like how we're going to solve it technically.
Hmm.
I think they're all smarter than me now, but I have more domain expertise, so I can still bring something to the table.
So now that you've been working on this for over a decade, where do you see the next 5 years in terms of the product evolving?
Yeah, so I think it's the way we think about it is that today, um, to use our product, you have to have engineers, you have to go
Yeah.
build this, you have to, you still have to do a lot. So it's kind of like we solve this like small, or not small, but we solve this like healthy sized chunk of like
Hmm.
what you need to do. I think we have the opportunity to like continue to expand that. And I think that's what you've seen kind of Twilio do, where they have if you just want to go send a text message with them, great, right? But they have like 60 other products, and if you want to go build, call center software on top of them, they actually have a product that will help you do that.
Hmm.
And so they have extra APIs built to help you go build call center software, or to go build SMS marketing software.
I see.
And so we can keep building up the stack. We don't want to go build like cookie cutter products because that's what other companies are doing. But we
Right,
can
right,
keep
right.
building more and more on the API to make our customers' lives easier and easier. And so for us, it's all about the kind of flywheel of like okay, we've got this going and we're delivering customer value and people are using us. How do we the way to get momentum is just to keep eating into the market of maybe today somebody would look and say, oh, that's just a little bit too much work to build on top of them. I'm going to
Hmm.
try to find an off the shelf solution, or I'm going to settle for something else. Every little incremental step we get is like another, like widening your TAM just like a little bit. And so that's how we kind of think about it. It's just it's continuing to build new features, to build new products, and to like continue to expand our market.
How do you find new customers in the space?
Yeah, so it's for years it was largely inbound. Like people found
Interesting,
us.
huh?
And I think it's because we have a great VP of marketing who did a great job kind of writing content. And so, and then also like customer referrals, right? Like a lot of the people at, different companies go to another company and they used us there or they heard about us. And so there's kind of between word of mouth and then inbound and just people searching for, ad serving API or decision engine API, or how to write an auction, how to write auction software, and it's kind of like, well, if you're Googling this, like, if you're Googling like how to run
Yeah,
an
yeah,
ad
yeah.
auction, like you got a lot to learn. So if you find an API and like, do this for you, like it's pretty compelling. But now as we've started to scale, we've started to do more, more marketing, more kind of, outbound and figure out who could be a good, fit and trying to reach out to
Mhm.
them and things like that.
How do you determine who is a good fit for your outbound? Because I think that's a pretty big question a lot of companies face. That once they've run out of, I guess, their personal network connections, or they run out of their friends of friends, they need to start figuring out, okay, what's a scalable solution to approaching company growth? And I think it's a big question for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is honing in on like who's using you now and why are they using you. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the things that we've always, because we're an API platform, like we have people using us for all kinds of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And like, so as an example, we have people who use us to serve ads into podcasts. And so they've written software on top of us. We don't actually handle like putting it into the file that gets downloaded, right? We're just saying like this is the ad to serve. And so like at one point, we looked at that, we signed a couple customers there, and we're like, oh, like maybe this is a big market for us.
Hmm.
And so you have to go talk to them and say, well, what problem did we solve for you? And they're like, oh, it's this kind of decision engine piece we didn't have to do, but we do our own downloads and this other, and we mux it into the audio and things like that. And so we can go look at the rest of the market and say, well, how big is this market? Like, what's the opportunity here? And at the end, we kind of said, well, like it's an interesting market, but it's not huge. And like Spotify might eat it all. Like, is it really the top thing we should be working on? And we're like, well, not yet, right? So it just kind of goes in the the backlog where you say maybe we'll focus on this in the future. Um, but then with like marketplaces where we work with a lot of different marketplaces, we just saw, okay, like these are, they're like a sweet spot customer. Like when they come to us, they when they get in touch, they have like a high close rate, they have a high success rate, they refer other people to us. And so we said, okay, like let's just focus on reaching out to marketplaces first, right? And so it's really finding, like, I think a lot of times people take like a shotgun approach of like, hey, anybody that could use it, right? But it's like the more targeted you can be, the more success you're going to have. Because we work with like a number of like food delivery companies, right? So like we can go to a new food delivery company and say, hey, we work with so and so and so and so. Like, we could definitely, see if this would work for you. And that works a lot better than, just going to some other random company and saying we work with
Right.
this other random company, right?
How many years did it take for you to figure that out?
I think we're still learning today, right? Like we still find new use cases today, or realize that older use cases were a better fit for than we used to be. But kind of that approach to the market, I think we were trying it from day one. But I'd say like early on, we signed one big customer and we learned the wrong lesson, which is we said, oh, like this customer bought us, like I bet you all these other sites will. But then none of the other sites did. And we went back and we're kind of talking to the people who bought us, and we're like, why did you really do it? And they're like, oh, it's actually for this reason, right? Like it's not all the things that it's not all the problems you're solving for us. It's actually this other kind of unique thing to them is why they used our software. And then we're like, oh, that would have saved us like 4 months of marketing and sales effort. Um, so that's the thing I would like, talking to like newer founders, it's really, finding that like who is that sweet spot customer that's going to make your life the easiest, and spending more time on them and less on like trying to go as wide as possible. But then you have to iterate, right? You have to keep finding like who's the next like right fit.
So once you find these right fit companies and you want to make sure their product is properly tailored to their needs, how do you address that? Do you do like multi-hour long like user company sessions, or do you do company surveys? How do you get the insights from your customers into the product?
Yeah, I mean, so we totally cheat because we're an API, we get all this like market intel of people already using us. So
Mm,
like with marketplaces where we said, okay, we've had a couple marketplaces sign up, they're doing well. Let's spend an inordinate amount of time with those two customers, right? And really dig into like what are the problems they're solving. And then you start having sales calls with new ones and figure out what are the problems they have, right? And so we never went and did like kind of market research outside of either who was currently a customer or who we're trying to sell to. And I think it also helps, a lot of times people caution against, in the sales process saying like, oh, we'll build that for you, or we'll add a feature for you, or things like that. But it actually works really well if you do it in a disciplined way,
Right.
right? Like if you're saying like we're going after marketplaces, we have some current customers, so we've shown that it works. And then we're talking to a potential new customer and they say, oh, you have everything we need except X, right? And then you say, well, like, let's go back and talk to our other marketplace customers and say, well, what if we had X? Would you use it? And they're like, oh shit, yeah, that'd be great. Like if you had that, like we would use it in a second. And then we're like, okay,
Hmm.
like what, do we believe X is the right thing for the product? And if the answer is yes, then go build it, sign the deal, right? Because but you're validating it, right? You're not just like taking orders and doing whatever they asked for. You're validated in that market, and because we knew that like we wanted it, like we wanted to go deeper into marketplaces. If somebody had come along on the, some industry we don't see like a good fit for and said, oh, we need, we would need feature X, we just say, yeah, it's not, we're not going to do that. Sorry. Right. Which always is painful, but you have to, otherwise you end up with, you're trying to focus on like 10 things.
I know the word cheat has a lot of negative connotations, but I actually really like the idea of like cheating or hacking in the sense that you take advantage of whatever competitive tools that you have available to you that your competitors don't have to come across or to create a solution that other your competitors couldn't otherwise done in the same amount of time or in the same way or at the same level of efficacy or cost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the other way I'd say we kind of cheat in that sense, is that we've like made ourselves solidly like just like we only work for our customers. We don't sell to advertisers. We don't
Right,
like
right.
do anything with the data. Like we're literally, a data, we're like AWS. Or like whatever you put into us is like yours, there's no sharing. And that means we can't go sell ads against our customers, things like that, which we don't want to do anyway. But it
Right,
also
right.
makes our lives like like so much easier, right? Like for a lot of our competitors, it's like they're having to deal with GDPR or CCPA or all these things, and it's like, well, we don't do anything with anybody's data, right? Like it's our customers' data, just like Amazon. So it's really
Mhm.
simple. I think that's another like kind of hack in like solving the challenges is that you make your job easier when you don't try to do things that cause you lots of legal or privacy headaches.
It's kind of silly to me how even in 2021 there's a lot of apps that I feel like overreach in the iOS or Android world in terms of their permissions because I feel like that probably leads to headaches somewhere down the line.
Yep. Yeah, I mean they're doing that, right? Like iOS just launched now it has the like, this app wants to track you.
Right,
We
right.
say no. Um, but yeah, that stuff went really crazy, right? Like, and I think that's our kind of approach to privacy is, I think it's really clear. Like if you go to Ticketmaster and you see a show promoted to you and you're like, oh, they must be like targeting me because I saw that band before, right? Like, okay, like it's Ticketmaster. They know who I am. I'm logged in. I bought it. I ordered
Yeah,
tickets
yeah.
from them before. They're showing me tickets to the same band. Like it all makes sense. Nobody feels like there's a privacy issue there, right?
Right, right.
But when you go to like another random app in your phone and you see an ad for tickets to like a show that you might like,
Right.
how the hell did my data get from Ticketmaster to somewhere else to over here to over this, right? And like that's like I think it's just a simple kind of privacy guideline, which is like, would it feel bad if you thought, your data was being shared around in that way?
Something I love about the entrepreneurship and early stage company space is the fact that a bunch of founders recognize that I love my privacy. I love the fact that my data belongs to me within my platform, and they create the platform that promotes the privacy of their customers' data, and the customers' data belongs to the customers and not the company. And I would love to see this trend extend upwards into the larger organizations. I doubt it's going to happen anytime soon, but I'll like that's my dream in terms of user privacy.
Yeah, it's funny. We always see like for a long time, like I'm a big privacy advocate. Like we tried to work, or we did work with the EFF around trying to get do not track
Hmm.
adopted. Like we were the first like ad platform to enable do not track. But we found that like so many companies, you're right, like when they're smaller, they're very founder led. They're like, we'll never track anybody. But then at some point down the road, like somebody's like, oh, if we did X, like we could get more sales or marketing would work better. And they just slowly went down that road. And so I remember we had a big customer who signed up because it was all about privacy.
Hmm.
But then down the road, like, they raise more money, the CEO switches out, and then they're like, this privacy is costing us $10 million a year. Like, if we, and so it's tough, right? And that's why I think it has to be like, I think privacy is the same way I think about, like, like the environment and things like that, right? It has to be a good decision independent of the fact that it's like good for privacy or good for the environment, right? Like, and it's like, if people view it as having to take their medicine, like, they're not going to do it. But if it's just naturally better, then like people will do it, right? And I think that's like the best way to make these kind of changes. It's like on the privacy side, it's like, well, how do we make it so people can build ad platforms that are better than ones that invade your privacy, not ones that are like 10% worse, or even equal, but like,
Right.
can be better. And I think they can. Like, there's still some way to go there, but yeah, I mean, that's the approach I think that has to be to get privacy kind of spread out, or just Apple turn it off for everybody, which they did, which works as well.
At the bigger picture level, it's cool that founders have such a passion for their products and they want their products to be as pristine as possible in terms of like user friendliness, user efficacy. And it's unfortunate that there's like this meme in like engineering school where like all it takes is an engineer to sell their project to someone on Wall Street and they'll like monetize as much as possible. Like I think it's I forgot who said it, but something along the lines of like, oh, like capitalism is all about maximizing shareholder value, and I don't know if I agree with that ethos, just because I feel like when you extract all the value out, there's very minimal like customer surplus. There's very minimal like I guess loyalty, because I think a lot of people use platforms because it's just the best solution of its kind, not because it respects their privacy the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting though, the maximizing shareholder value line. I think actually is true, but I think it's one of those things that people use in the wrong way.
And for the
Because
short term, right?
you know what I mean? Because yeah, so it's like short term versus long term. Because there's always these cases where it's like, well, we could double the price of Coca-Cola tomorrow, and it would work really well, right? But then it would open us up to competitors on the low side. It would alienate a bunch of people in other economies, like all these sort of things. So like in the 50, 100-year horizon, it's the worst decision possible for Coca-Cola. But if you're like the CEO trying to get your bonus in Q2,
Right,
it's like
right.
a great, right? And so I think, and like the privacy things, right? Like when you look at Facebook, like they made a lot of decisions around privacy to fuel the like immediate growth of Facebook, but it's absolutely hurt them in the long run because so many people just won't use Facebook anymore, right? Or so many people equate it
Right.
to taking over elections or fraud or all these different things, and it's like like they got that early growth because they let anybody have API access to all your data, and like let all these apps join, and
Right.
that helped with a ton of early growth, but they paid the price in the long run.
It's definitely unfortunate. I definitely feel like one of my fears with taking up investor money is the fact that they'll give me that pressure to maximize returns in the short term, because I think investors generally, I think the most patient investors will probably wait maybe 7 to 8 years. Beyond that, I think they're just the long term beyond those 8 years are kind of irrelevant to most investors, unless you're talking about the Warren Buffetts who plan to hold near indefinitely if possible.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think most people just don't fit in that category, and therefore they put a pressure like, hey, you have 2 years to give me X return, and if not, then I won't give you future rounds of funding or give you connections to other, I don't know, people in the industry anymore. I think it's a
It's
dangerous
starting to
path to go down.
change. Yeah, I mean, I think it's starting to change some, at
Hmm.
least with like the bigger VCs. And I think the reason it's starting to change is because some of these companies that went public and then actually returned better like in the public markets than they did from like their A round or whatever.
Oh,
So
interesting.
when you look at people like you look at some of these companies like HubSpot and Twilio
Yeah.
and these companies have just gone on tears once they hit the public market. Like you're seeing more and more VCs actually hold on to the stock in the public market, like not even
Hmm.
distribute it to their LPs. Like they
Right.
actually continue to just hold it for longer. Like I think Union Square has done that with Etsy. Like they may not Union Square may not technically still hold Etsy shares, but I know they did for a while, like post public, and like Fred Wilson's like still on the board.
Hmm.
So I think you know there's probably just like the same as like the caricature of investment bankers in engineering school. Like there's the same
Right.
kind
Right.
of caricature of investors where like there are absolutely some that are
For sure.
focused on, hey, like are you hitting these milestones? We have to get to exit velocity. Like my fund is this long. We're 6 years into my fund and we got 4 years to do this. But I don't think the good ones aren't that way, right? Like the good
Yeah.
ones, like they want that really big long term value creation. But I do think like where especially where investors' incentives are disaligned, is when it comes to like the approach of like being successful or not, right? And so, VCs a lot of times are making a lot of bets, right? And they need like, and there's like, it's kind of like a ratio, right? Like some
Right.
percentage of these companies are just going to die, some percentage are going to like return what we invested, and then there's going to be like a handful of like really big, exponential winners, right? Like
Right.
Ubers and stuff like that, right? To like return like all your returns are in those top, decile, right? But like you as a founder is on like one of those, right? And so like
Right.
they have like the numbers are in their favor, right? It's like, oh, like we've invested in 20 companies, we're pretty sure two or three are going to do really well. But if you're on one of those, they're not worried about your rocket blowing up, right? Like they're
Right.
going to shoot like 20 rockets and one of them's going to get to the moon, but you're on one of those rockets, and if it blows up, you're out. I know some like people have talked about for years about if like essentially funds should like give fund equity to like CEOs, right? Like
Hmm.
or something like that, right? Like you should get like you trade some of your equity for equity in
In the bigger,
in
yeah,
the
yeah. Huh.
fund, but none of the VCs want that because they want you to stay hungry and like only you're only successful if you're successful,
Right. Right. Right.
and some of that stuff, which is kind of garbage. But
So what do you recommend to, I guess, early stage entrepreneurs who are considering raising funding for the first time? What would you share with them?
yeah, I mean, I think I would say first I'd say it's a lot of work. It's hard. It's you're gonna pitch a lot of times unless you just left Stripe, and
Yeah.
you're like a great engineer, then you might have to pitch like two times. But for all the rest of us, like you have to, you're gonna talk to a lot of people, um, and it's really to find somebody who's aligned, like be honest about what your vision for the company is, and find somebody who's aligned with like that vision for the company. Because I think a lot of times I've heard of, I've talked to founders who are like, well, like I'm not sure if this is that can be that huge of a thing, but like that's what investors want to hear. And I'm
Hmm.
like, you're in for a world of hurt, right? Because like, they're expecting a rocket ship and you're like, I'm happy with like a hang glider. And it's like if you want a hang glider, like you can find people who invest in you to say, I want to build a, profitable business, with a handful of people and get to a couple million in revenue and, move to Hawaii, right? Like
Hmm.
you could raise money, but it's not going to be like a traditional VC or angel investor,
Right.
right? You have
Right.
to find the right capital for like what you want to do. And then, yeah, I think it's like finding people who you really trust because you will work with them for a long, long time. And if possible, like talk to people they've invested in before where things went poorly, not when it went
Hmm.
well. Because when it goes well, everybody's happy, right? Like you want to talk to somebody who, the company didn't go well or things went sideways or they had to figure different things out. Those are the people to kind of talk to. But it's a good problem to have if you can get to where you can turn down investors.
How many times did you need to pitch until you were able to raise the funding that you wanted?
I think, let's see. So for like the seed round we did, oh man, it was probably 30 or 40 pitches. Um, and then when we recently did our A round, I probably talked to total like 50 to 60 people, but then it was like only maybe 10 or so like actually kind of dug in a little bit deeper.
I see.
That's the other thing too is like I think that like a lot of people don't understand like investors take these calls every day, all day
Right.
long,
Right. Right.
right? Like they are doing these, they're doing, some of these guys are doing 30 meetings, 40 meetings a week, and then they're making one investment a year.
Right.
And so you have to do the math there. And so it's like I think a lot of people, an investor would kind of like, say, "Oh, this is really interesting. Thanks. Like I'll talk with my partners and follow up." Like, and he doesn't follow up. Like he's gone. Like
Right.
I've talked to people who like hold out this hope of like, oh, he sounded like he really liked it. It's like, you do your follow ups. Like send your follow up emails, send them extra information, send them good things. But like for the most part, if they're not latching on, like they're gone, right? And so there is like a numbers game aspect to it. Like you have to try to find the like perfect match of all the investors out there with you and like the company you're building. And I
How
think
do you
like
find?
there's this real disservice that goes on where people are like, money's so cheap right now. It's so easy to fundraise. It's always absolutely hard to fundraise
Mm.
because for all, I think, we always see all these funding announcements and there's all this money flowing around, but there's a lot more people trying to get money than
For
there
sure.
are money, investors and money going around.
So how do you find, like, how does a founder, like, even find this pool of all investors to reach out to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting better. There's definitely some people that you can, reach out to. Like it used to be like, oh, you have to get a warm intro or I won't talk to you.
Yeah.
So I think there are some, there's people on Twitter you can reach out to. And there's but I still think networking is one of the best ways to do it.
Hmm.
Especially like the seed round, like trying to figure out like how do I, like I mean nowadays, right? Like an accelerator is like one of the best ways. Like I think a lot of
Hmm.
people like apply to accelerators, get rejected, and they'll say we'll just raise some money. Like all the people that if you're getting rejected from an accelerator, like there's the same type of people that are going to be looking at investing money, right? And so like if I started a new company tomorrow, like I would seriously consider like going through Y Combinator or
Okay.
Techstars, like if they would let me, right?
Yeah.
Just because I think that like the advantage it gets you when you go to raise money is worth
Yeah.
what you give up. And maybe the program would be, I think the program is great for like new founders. I don't know if it'd be good for me at this stage, but like I would go do it because I think it just gives you a huge advantage. Um, and then I think otherwise, there's kind of nowadays like you can start writing articles and tweeting tweet threads or start podcasts or do all these sort of things that like will get your name out there and like will introduce you to interesting people and make connections to potentially raise.
How did you personally handle the discouragement from getting like a ton of rejections? I think most people, if you were to tell them like, "Oh, I want you to go do this task," but the success rate is call it like 3-4%. Like most people would feel pretty discouraged and they would question whether the pitch is wrong or the product is wrong or they're wrong. Like I
Yeah.
imagine like all those thoughts run through your head. Like how do you like get past that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like well, it's funny. I think this is why a lot of times you have salespeople are great CEOs because sales by its nature, like, is trying to do something 30 or 40 times and getting it once and then you're
Right.
happy. Like you have to have like like short memory. Like, you just remember the success and don't think about all the failures.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think it's especially tough when you get attached to certain investors. Like I think pretty quickly you get like numb to the, hey, we had a call and it wasn't a good fit. And,
Okay.
I sent them a message, they never, they ghosted me and never sent anything back. You're like, okay, fine. Right? Like wasn't a good fit. You have to, just look at it as like, it's like if you ask somebody out on a date and they say no, right? You can either take it as like, oh, I'm like crushed and I'll never, or you're just like, ah, okay. Like, a lot of fish in the sea. Um, I think when it's particularly tough is like when you do go deep with somebody, right? Like where you get to a partner meeting or you get to, they do a lot of due diligence and then they say no. And that's when you're like, oh man, like something's wrong. Right.
Hmm.
And I think it's just a matter of, I think that's like a big part of being a founder is just dealing with rejection all the time, like the highs and the lows, right? Like that's the big part of it is that you will, you'll get rejected in sales and you'll lose, you'll have an employee quit who you thought was like your best employee, or you'll have, you'll make an offer to somebody and they'll take somebody other, take a different offer. And so
Hmm.
fundraising is just like all those other things. So I think that's really why I think when investors are looking at founders, they do look for like conviction because they know you're just going to get beat up for the next like 6 years in every way imaginable. And so it's like that conviction and resiliency that I think is like the biggest indicator of like success. Like, can you take getting beat up and keep going, right? Like, it's like if you're gonna pick a boxer, he's got like the really flashy, like, heavy hitter, or you got the guy who can just get beat up for 4 rounds and then win. Like, that's the CEO founders one's getting beat up for 4 rounds and then wins.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation and I really value your insights. I just want to make sure I respect your time and I just want to end this call with the same question I ask all of my guests. What's the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if that's something they'd like to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So on Twitter, I am Avery J. And then you can also email me at the opposite, J Avery at Kevel, Kevel.co.
How did that reversal happen?
Well, because I got to Twitter just a little bit too late. I think I signed
Okay.
up in like, I don't know, it was pretty early, but just somebody got J Avery just before me.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for your time today, James.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.